So I also want to say a few words about Robert Lampman for those of you who don't know him and his legend. So Bob was a professor of economics here at UW for over 30 years, and he was the founder and guiding spirit of the Institute for Research on Poverty. By all accounts, he was an exceptional and unique scholar, teacher, mentor, and individual, and he was well known across the country as the intellectual architect of the U.S. war on poverty. So he served on the Council of Economic Advisors in the 1960s, and he authored the 1964 chapter of the Economic Report of the President that really became the blueprint for the Johnson administration's war on poverty. His subsequent work and research spanned really the gamut of social welfare programs, and he became known for, when considering any program or policy, he became known for asking the simple question, what does it do for the poor? So during his time in DC, he worked with a range of federal officials, and he really argued that we had a think tank in RAND for the Department of Defense, and what we really needed was an outside of Washington think tank to guide the war on poverty and to study the nature, causes, consequences, and cures for poverty and inequality. So as a result, in 1966, the University of Wisconsin was awarded a grant to establish the Institute for Research on Poverty. So IRP is now 52 years strong. We are once again the sole federally funded poverty research center. And our work continues to honor Bob's vision to create better anti-poverty policies informed by rigorous and multidisciplinary research. So upon Bob's death in 1997, IRP and the Lampman family established this lecture. And IRP organizes it each year in cooperation with the UW Economics Department. And we feature eminent poverty scholars whose work address the topics that Bob devoted his career to. So today, Speaker Richard Rothstein is among the very top public intellectuals taking on issues of race and ethnicity, education, law, and public policy. He's a distinguished fellow of the Economic Policy Institute and a senior fellow emeritus at the Thurgood Marshall Institute at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and the Haas Institute at UC Berkeley. He's written extensively on racial and class-based achievement gaps in education, on educational accountability and education reform. His most recent book, which clearly you're all aware of that he's going to speak on today, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, provides an in-depth, precise, and exceptionally insightful historical analysis of how federal, state, and local policy explicitly functioned to segregate metropolitan areas nationwide, creating racially homogenous neighborhoods in patterns that he argues violate the Constitution and require remediation. His analysis shows that rather than being primarily driven by private interests and private actions, racial segregation in the U.S. has largely resulted from explicit laws, government actions, and court rulings, and that this history continues to influence the current social structure and is a major contributor to much of today's social strife. So William Jewis Wilson characterized The Color of Law as being one of those rare books that will be discussed and debated for many decades. And I can't think of much higher praise than that from a much higher caliber guy and scholar. So I'm thrilled, Richard, that you're willing to discuss this important work with us today, and it's a great pleasure to introduce you. So please welcome Richard Rothstein.
Thank you very much, Lonnie. As you all know, in the 20th century, we as a nation made a decision that we were going to abolish segregation, racial segregation. We thought it was wrong. We thought it was immoral. We understood that it was harmful, both to African Americans and to whites. And we concluded it was unconstitutional. A caste system was not consistent with a constitutional democracy such as we claim to have. And beginning in the 1930s, civil rights lawyers challenged segregation in law schools. They figured that if judges were too stupid to understand anything else, they might be able to figure out that you couldn't get a good legal education in a segregated law school. And then they used that precedent to abolish segregation in higher education, both graduate schools and then four-year institutions. And then, as you all know, in 1954, we abolished segregation in elementary and secondary schools in the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And then the civil rights movement in the 1960s succeeded in abolishing segregation in everything from lunch counters to water fountains to buses to public accommodations of all kinds. And yet, we've left untouched the biggest segregation of all that overwhelms everything else and hangs over our entire society, and that is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. There are clearly defined areas in every one that I've lived in that are all white or mostly white, or all African American and mostly African American. And all of us accept this as part of the natural environment. It's not that we think it's a good thing. We say it's too bad, but we think it's sort of natural, normal, something we accept. It's not that we've tried to do anything about it and have failed. We've never even tried because we accept it as normal. And I think that in some respects it's easy to understand why that's the case. It's a lot harder to undo residential segregation than any of the other segregations that I mentioned. If we abolish segregation in water fountains or buses or lunch counters, the next day you drink from any water fountain or you sit at any lunch counter or ride anywhere on the bus. But if we abolish segregation in neighborhoods, the next day things wouldn't look much different. And so what we've done, all of us, and I don't accept myself here, what we've all of us done is adopted a rationalization for our inaction, a way that justifies our tolerating something that we really do understand is inconsistent with having the kind of constitutional democracy that we claim to have. And we've given that rationalization a name, and the rationalization is de facto segregation. We say that residential segregation is somehow different from all of these other segregations that we abolished. All of these other segregations that we abolished, forms of segregation, were created by government policy, by laws, by regulations. But residential segregation is somehow different. Residential segregation sort of evolved informally, naturally, without government participation, without government regulation and guidance and structure. And we say, if it happened by accident, it pretty much has to be undone by accident. And the Supreme Court has adopted that view. It helped promote the view. And the Supreme Court has said that if you have de facto segregation, segregation that arose because of private prejudice or homeowners in white neighborhoods that might not have wanted to sell a home to an African American, or real estate agents might have, in their private capacity, steered families to same-race neighborhoods. Or maybe African Americans and whites just happen to like to live with each other of the same race and choose same-race neighborhoods. Or maybe it's just the result of market forces. African Americans tend to have lower incomes on average than whites and typically can't afford to move into middle-class white communities. All of these informal, personal, non-governmental decisions is what created residential segregation. And the Supreme Court has said if you have this kind of de facto segregation, not only shouldn't we do anything about it, but we're prohibited from doing anything about it. It would be a constitutional violation to remedy something, to take positive governmental action to remedy a condition that wasn't created by government. Only if you had, the Supreme Court says, something that calls de jure segregation. Segregation by law, public policy, regulation, as we'd had in schools and water fountains and buses. Only then, not only would we be permitted to desegregate, but actually we'd be compelled to, because it's a violation of the Constitution if it had been created in that way. Well, as some of you know, I spent much of the last 30 years until I started this project working on education policy. And working on education policy, I came to understand, I did a lot of writing about this, that the cause of the achievement gap between African American and white children was not because they didn't get tested enough, and not because teachers had low expectations, and not because teachers were too poorly trained, but because of the actual conditions from which they came, the social and economic conditions in which they came, which predicted lower achievement, notwithstanding the expectations that teachers had and the accountability of their schools and the quality of instruction. And I wrote a lot about trying to explain the pathways by which these social and economic disadvantages actually translated into low achievement, because to most people it didn't make common sense that the poverty would cause school failure. Why should how much money a child's parents have affect how much the child can learn if it has a good teacher? So I tried to explain all the actual pathways through which this work. And I won't take a lot of time this afternoon talking about it, but for example, we know that African American children in urban areas in this country have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle class children because of the environmental conditions in which they live in low income neighborhoods. And if a child has asthma, the child may be drowsy from being awake at night when the child comes to school, from being awake wheezing, may be sleepless, may be absent more. Asthma is the largest cause of chronic school absenteeism in this country today. And if a child has asthma, it may be that a child can get some special attention from the teacher to make up for the days that the child was absent. But on average, if you have 2 groups of children who are equal in every respect, except one group has a higher rate of asthma than the other, that group is going to have lower average achievement, even with special attention from a teacher and even with higher expectations. It's not to say that some children with asthma won't have higher achievement than typical children without, because there's a distribution of outcomes for every human characteristic. But on average, it's a matter of logic. If a child is in school less, a group of children is in school less often, they're going to do less well. And there are so many of these conditions that all, in the same way, have an understandable pathway through which they predict lower achievement, whether it's lead poisoning or whether it's stress from parental economic insecurity or homelessness, or you can go on and on. And I did go on and on for many years about this. But then I came to understand that it's one thing if a child has asthma and comes to school and the teacher tries to give the child special attention. The child does a little bit better as a result. But what happens when you have a school where every child is not only suffering from asthma, but some have lead poisoning and some are under stress and some are homeless? If every child has one of these disadvantages, it's inconceivable that a school with children like this can achieve at the same levels as the school where children come to school well-rested and healthy and well-nourished and secure in their home life and so forth. And we call schools that where every child has these kinds of disadvantages, we call them segregated schools. And the reality is in this country today that schools are segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. In fact, schools are more segregated today than they ever have been in the last 45 years in this country, and it's because of neighborhood segregation. So that's what I was thinking about some 10 years ago when I started to think about this topic. I began to wonder why schools were segregated and why the neighborhoods in which they're located were segregated. And then I read in 2007 a Supreme Court decision in which the Supreme Court undertook an examination of 2 integration plans, desegregation plans, in the school districts of Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. And in both of those districts, the districts had, understanding the things I was just talking about and the harm that segregation does to educational outcomes, decided it was going to try to do a very modest desegregation program. And both districts gave children, high school students, a choice of which school they would attend within the district. But if the choice was going to further imbalance the school racially, that choice would not be favored in favor of a choice of a student who would help to desegregate the school. So if you had a school that was all white or mostly white, and one place left, and a black and a white child both applied for it, that the black child would be given some preference because that child would help to desegregate the school. It was a trivial plan. You couldn't imagine a more trivial desegregation plan. I mean, most young people don't want to go to school outside their own neighborhoods and away from their friends, so they don't choose schools like that in the first place. And secondly, the cases where you have one place left in the school and both a black and a white child apply for that last place, I mean, how trivial is that? How trivial is that? But the Supreme Court was outraged. It said this was a violation of the Constitution, to implement a plan like that, and the Supreme Court said that it was a violation of the Constitution because the schools in Louisville and Seattle were segregated, because the neighborhoods in which they were located were segregated. John Roberts, Chief Justice, wrote the plurality opinion. I thought that's a wise observation on his part. He was right. That's the reason that schools in Louisville and Seattle were segregated. But then he went on to say that the schools in Louisville and Seattle were segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located were segregated, and because those neighborhoods were segregated de facto without government participation, it was unconstitutional to make an explicit attempt to reverse that process in the schools. And I read this decision and remembered reading a case that arose out of Louisville, Kentucky. I wrote about this in the book, if any of you have read it, where a white homeowner some years back, living in a white single-family home suburb outside Louisville called Shively, had an African-American friend, a decorated Navy veteran who was living within the city of Louisville. The African-American friend had a wife and daughter and wanted to move to a more middle-class neighborhood, but no realtor would sell him a home. And so the white homeowner bought another home in the suburb of Shively and resold it to his African-American friend. The African-American family moved in. And when the African-American family moved in, a mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. The police somehow couldn't identify any perpetrators. They firebombed the home. The police couldn't identify any perpetrators. They dynamited the home, and the police couldn't identify any perpetrators. And when this riot was over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner who had sold the home to the African-American for sedition. 15-year sentence for sedition. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound much to me like de facto segregation. And I had known a little bit more about it than that. I knew of instances here and there, but I had always assumed that government participation was episodic in racial segregation, but not really the major cause. I accepted the myth of de facto segregation. And then a year or so later, after reading this decision, I happened to be in a seminar with Professor Brighouse, and the seminar participants were charged with coming up with a new research project. So I decided I would look into whether or not this Louisville incident was simply an aberration, or whether the government participation in the creation of residential segregation in this country was so systematic, so powerful, so consistent, that the whole de facto notion was a myth. And that's what I concluded as a result of this research. It is a myth. And if it's a myth, and I want to emphasize this, if it's a myth, if residential segregation is as de jure as water fountain segregation or school segregation or lunch counter segregation, then we have an obligation to do something about it. It's not simply that we could do something about it. We have a constitutional obligation to do something about it. It's a violation of civil rights. It's a violation of the 5th and the 14th Amendments. And all of us, each of us, has an obligation to somehow figure out a way of developing a new civil rights movement to deal with residential segregation in the same way we dealt with these other segregations in the 20th century. So let me spend a few minutes this afternoon describing some of the major policies that the federal government followed to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live near one another in urban areas in this country. I'm not going to go into all of the policies. There were so many of them, but let me say that it was consistent through federal, state, and local levels. They all reinforced each other, and we do have a de jure system of residential segregation. The first one I want to talk about is public housing. All of us, I know, just like we have the myth of de facto segregation, we also think we know what public housing is. It's a place where poor people live, where lots of mothers with children, single parents with children, lots of young men without access to jobs in the formal economy, acting out, engaging in oppositional behavior that attracts attention to the police, and a cycle of violence that we've seen in so many places. That's what we think of as public housing. But that's not how public housing began in this country. The first civilian public housing in this country was constructed in the New Deal by the Franklin Roosevelt administration at the beginning of the Depression, and it was always for working class families who had employment. It was not for the 25% of the country that was unemployed. It was for people who had jobs. The poor were not permitted into public housing. It was, the purpose of public housing was to provide housing for families who were employed, but for whom no housing was available in the Depression. And everywhere, the Public Works Administration and the other federal agencies that succeeded it created segregated public housing, separate projects for African Americans and whites in cities all across the country, frequently segregating neighborhoods that hadn't previously been segregated, that were integrated. Now that may surprise you. In the mid-20th century, in the early 20th century, most urban areas had integrated neighborhoods. Not all neighborhoods were integrated. There were some clearly segregated neighborhoods, especially in places like Detroit and Chicago that had a large influx of African American migrants during the First World War. But most cities had integrated neighborhoods, at least some. I know if some of you may have read a couple of weeks ago, or maybe almost a month ago now, Linda Brown passed away, who was the daughter of the plaintiff in the Brown versus Board of Education in Topeka. And I don't know if you read the obituary in the New York Times. But what struck me was that she went to a segregated school. That's what Brown versus Board of Education was about. But she lived in an integrated neighborhood. Her playmates were white and black. Not just a few whites, but it was an integrated neighborhood that she lived in. And this was commonplace everywhere. It was commonplace because workers typically didn't have automobiles to get to work. Not typically, they rarely had automobiles to get to work. And factory districts were typically located in the same downtown areas where working class families had to live, because they had to be able the workers had to be able to walk to work. And so if you had a factory district with Irish immigrant workers and Italian immigrant workers and Jewish immigrant workers and African Americans and rural migrants all living in the same district, they had to live in roughly the same neighborhoods. And the other reason we had integrated neighborhoods everywhere was that the center of life in most cities at that time was the railroad station in the middle of downtown, and the railroads would only hire African Americans as baggage handlers. And on the West Coast, at the terminal of the Intercontinental Railroad, as Pullman car porters. So you had to have African Americans living in these neighborhoods as well, so that they could walk to work. They couldn't drive to work, to be baggage handlers, and so these were integrated neighborhoods. The great African American novelist, playwright, poet Langston Hughes. Some of you may have read his autobiography called The Big C. In it, he describes how he grew up in a Cleveland neighborhood that was integrated. He says his best friend in high school was Polish. He dated a Jewish girl. I'm not suggesting this is the norm, but it wasn't unique either in that period because of the kinds of urban geography that was necessary by the industrial structure of the country. And the Public Works Administration came into that integrated Cleveland neighborhood where Langston Hughes grew up and demolished integrated housing to create two separate projects, one for African Americans and one for whites, creating a pattern of segregation, at least in that part of Cleveland, that otherwise wouldn't have developed, and probably influenced the development of Cleveland overall as a segregated, heavily segregated city, more heavily than it would have been otherwise. In my book, I like to talk about self-satisfied places. I actually don't deal with Madison. I could. But self-satisfied places like Cambridge, Massachusetts, or Berkeley, California, where I spend a lot of time these days. Cambridge, the area around MIT, it was an integrated neighborhood. It was about half black, half white. Public Works Administration demolished housing in that neighborhood to build two separate projects, one white, one for African Americans, and it built other segregated projects. The federal government built other segregated projects during the New Deal elsewhere in Boston, creating a pattern of segregation that I can say much more confidently even than Cleveland, that would never otherwise have existed, because unlike Cleveland, Boston did not have a first great migration of any significance. So this was the creation of patterns that otherwise would not have and did not exist. Even Atlanta, the South, the water fountains, the buses, the lunch counters, they were all segregated, but not housing. There was an area near downtown Atlanta called the Flats, like the Central Square neighborhood of Cleveland, about half black, half white. The Public Works Administration demolished housing there, built a project for whites only, forcing the African Americans who lived in that neighborhood to double up with relatives or find less adequate housing elsewhere. During World War II, the government's creation of segregation accentuated. Hundreds of thousands of workers, as you know, flocked to centers of defense production during the war to get jobs in the war industry, jobs that hadn't been available in plentiful numbers during the Depression. And frequently the migration to centers of war production was so great that it overwhelmed the local population, the local cities. Here I talk about a suburb of Berkeley called Richmond. I learned that the Lampman family was living in Richmond shortly after that. Richmond was a deep water port. The Kaiser shipyards set up shop there to build Liberty ships for World War II. There were no shipyards there before the war. By the end of the war, Kaiser was employing 100,000 workers in the shipyards of Richmond. Richmond itself was a small community of about 20,000, almost all white. There were a few African Americans living in the outskirts who were Pullman car porters, wives of Pullman car porters, who were working as domestics in the homes of white families. But it was basically a white community of 20,000. The 100,000 migrants who came to work in the shipyards, if you consider their families, you're talking about an influx of maybe 300,000 people into a community of 20,000. Any of you city planners, can you figure out how to grow a community from 20,000 to 300,000 in just 4 years? It's quite a job. The federal government had to provide housing for these workers if it wanted the ships to continue to be produced. And in this all-white community, it created segregated housing. It built housing for the African-American workers along the railroad tracks, in the industrial area, going down through into Berkeley, and for the white workers in the more residential areas where white families were living. The African-American housing that the government built was temporary, shoddy, because the city of Richmond announced that any African-Americans who came to the city during the war would have to leave at the end of the war once their jobs had disappeared, but the whites were welcome to stay. This was public policy in the Berkeley area. And this happened throughout everywhere in the country, everywhere where the government built housing for war workers, East Coast, West Coast, North, South. It was segregated, creating patterns of segregation frequently that hadn't previously existed. The San Francisco Bay Area, for certain, had very, very few African Americans prior to World War II. You know, some descendants of the gold rush, as I say, the Pullman car porters were there, but basically it was a white area. The patterns of segregation that we still see in San Francisco Bay Area today were created by this government policy in World War II, and it didn't need to be. It didn't need to be, and I can say that with confidence, because we have an existence proof of one case. There was one project nationwide that I know of that was integrated, and that was in another shipyard in the San Francisco Bay Area, in Marin City, across the bay over the Golden Gate Bridge. And that one ramped up production so quickly that only single men could come. They couldn't absorb families. They put up barracks, and as the men came, they just gave out pillows and blankets, and without regard to race, so they had integrated barracks. And then when Marin City came to build housing for the families, the barracks had worked out so well that they built integrated housing for the families as well. This is the one case nationwide where the housing was not segregated, and not that if there were problems that would be an excuse for segregating it, but it demonstrates that there wasn't even a rationalization, a possible rationalization that could be used for this policy. After World War II, there was still an enormous housing shortage in the country. And not only had no housing been built during the Depression, except for the Public Works Administration projects and some other federal projects. And during World War II, it was prohibited to use construction materials for civilian purposes unless it was for the war workers. So no housing had been built, or little housing had been built at that time. And then millions of returning war veterans were coming home, needing housing, living in Quonset huts, doubled up with families. And it was a national crisis, a national housing crisis. President Truman had to respond to it. And he did so by proposing a vast expansion of the national public housing program. Remember, we're talking about housing for working class families, returning war veterans. They had jobs in the post-war boom. The whites had better jobs than the African Americans, but they were working in the post-war boom. These were not for poor people at this point, typically. He proposed a vast expansion of the National Housing Act. And conservatives in Congress wanted to defeat this expansion of public housing that Truman had proposed. They wanted to defeat it not for racial reasons, as I've described. It was all segregated. They didn't have any objection to that. They didn't want to defeat it because they didn't like poor people. There were no poor people living in public housing at that time, or very few. They wanted to defeat it simply because they thought that public housing was socialistic. The government shouldn't be involved in public housing. The private sector should take care of it. Not that the private sector was taking care of it, but that was their reason for opposition to public housing. And so they came up with a device that some of you are probably familiar with, a legislative device called a poison pill strategy. A poison pill strategy is one where opponents of a bill come up with an amendment which they think can be passed, will have majority support. But once the amendment is attached to the bill, the politics of the bill change and the entire bill goes down to defeat. So conservatives in Congress, and if there's nothing else you take away from this lecture, I hope you'll remember this story. Conservatives in Congress in 1949 proposed an amendment to the 1949 Housing Act that from now on, public housing had to be integrated. No more discrimination in public housing. No more segregation in public housing. It was a cynical proposal, obviously. They didn't want public housing at all, but they planned to vote for this amendment. They thought that Northern liberals would vote with them for this amendment, and that would create a majority to get the amendment attached to the bill. And then when the full bill came up to the floor for an integrated public housing program, the conservatives would flip and vote against the final bill. They would be joined by Southern Democrats who would vote against an integrated program, and the bill would go down to defeat. That was their strategy. So Northern liberals, led by the leading civil rights advocate in the United States Senate, Mr. Civil Rights, Hubert Humphrey, and his colleague Paul Douglas from the University of Chicago, and then a senator, campaigned and led a campaign against the integration amendment. Paul Douglas, Senator Douglas, got up on the floor of the Senate and he said something along, I'm paraphrasing, but I'd like to say to my Negro friends that they'll get more housing under this act without the amendment than they would get, which is no housing, if the amendment passes. And of course he was right. He was right. African Americans were desperately in need of housing. And so he was telling them that it would be better to have segregated housing than no public housing at all. I'm not sure he was right about the choice he made, but he was certainly right in describing what the consequences of defeating the integration, of adopting an integration amendment would be. So liberals persuaded their fellow liberals, Humphrey and Douglas, persuaded them to vote against the integration amendment. Southern Democrats, of course, joined them in voting against the integration amendment. The integration amendment went down to defeat. The full bill came up on the floor of the Senate and the House. Similar thing happened in the House as a continued segregated program. And it passed with a majority composed of Northern liberals who wanted public housing, whether it was integrated or not, and Southern Democrats who wanted public housing so long as it was segregated. And the federal government agencies then used this vote in Congress in 1949 against integration in public housing as its justification for continuing to segregate all housing programs of the federal government, not just public housing, for the next 15 years. I see some of you here are my age. 1949 to me doesn't seem so long ago. It's only yesterday that Congress voted on whether to integrate housing programs in this country and voted not to do so. Well, under the 1949 Housing Act, many of the giant projects that we're familiar with were built, places in Chicago like the Robert Taylor homes or Cabrini Green, or some of you may remember seeing photos of the Pruitt-Igoe project in St. Louis. There's two projects. The Pruitt project was for African Americans. The Igoe project was for whites. This was not de facto segregation. It's not that Igoe decided, that whites decided they liked the name Igoe, and that's where they applied to live, and blacks decided they liked the name Pruitt, and that's where this was de jure segregation. These were explicitly labeled projects. And the subtitle of my book is A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, because there's nothing hidden about this. This is quite in the open. Certainly the congressional debate was in the open. These projects were clearly designated, as were all the others I described. Well, shortly after these projects were built, a development occurred all over the country, which was systematic, consistent, and surprising. And that is that large numbers of vacancies developed in the white projects. And there were long waiting lists for the black projects. This was puzzling, or at least seemed to be puzzling, because these were all working class families. These people had jobs. As I say, the African Americans had jobs that weren't as good as the white jobs, but they were all working. They could all, similar economic circumstances. Why did all the vacancies develop in the white projects and not in the black projects? Soon, the situation became so untenable. You couldn't have projects in the same city with one with large vacancies or virtually empty and the other with long waiting lists, that local housing agencies and the federal government opened up all projects to African Americans. Soon they became virtually all African Americans as more and more whites left. At about the same time, you all know this industrial history, about the same time, industry left the cities, no longer needed to be located near either deep water ports or railroad terminals because highways had been built and industry could get their parts and ship their final products by truck. And so there were fewer and fewer jobs. Jobs disappeared from urban areas for the increasingly African American and soon almost all African American residents of public housing. Soon public housing had to be subsidized because workers could no longer pay for the rent, pay the cost of the housing and their rent. Once it was subsidized, maintenance disappeared. Of course, maintenance workers were no longer living in the projects as they had been before. These were people without jobs. And public housing became the kind of concentrated places of concentrated poverty, urban slums that we became familiar with as public housing. But that's not how public housing began, and that's not how it needs to be. But let me address why the white projects had all these vacancies and the black projects had long waiting lists. And that was because of another federal program, another New Deal program, that was even more powerful in creating a segregated racial landscape everywhere than the public housing program. And that was a program of the Federal Housing Administration, a New Deal agency that was established in 1934, the year after the Public Works Administration was established. And beginning in the 1940s and into the 1950s and 60s, the Federal Housing Administration embarked on a program, an explicit racial program, to suburbanize the white working class population into single-family homes in all white suburbs. This was an explicit racial program. It was not the action of rogue bureaucrats. It was the official policy of the Federal Housing Administration. And you're familiar with all of the subdivisions that were created in every metropolitan area in the country as a result of this FHA policy. The best known is probably Levittown, east of New York City, 17,000 homes there. Some of you may recall a song that Pete Seeger used to sing about it was Malvina Reynolds' song about the little boxes on the hillside made of ticky-tacky, and they all looked the same. That was an equally large, almost equally large subdivision south of San Francisco, another all-white subdivision created by the Federal Housing Administration. Los Angeles became the symbol of suburbanization in this country in the 1950s and 60s, and suburbs like Lakewood or Panorama City, Westchester, all of these were FHA-created developments for whites only. You know, Levitt, to take that example, Levitt could never have assembled the capital on his own to build 17,000 homes for which he had no buyers. No bank would be crazy enough. I know banks are crazy, but they're not that crazy. No banks would be crazy enough to lend someone the money to buy land and build 17,000 homes for which he had no buyers as yet. The only way Levitt and any of these other developers, whether it was Henry Dolger with the little boxes or Mark Taper building Lakewood in Los Angeles, any of these developers, the only way they could get the capital to build these giant subdivisions was by going to the Federal Housing Administration, submitting their plans for the development for approval of the construction materials they were going to use, the architectural design, the layout of the streets in the subdivision, and an explicit commitment not to sell a home to an African American, required by the Federal Housing Administration. The Federal Housing Administration even required, as a condition of these guarantees, developers like Levitt to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. These deeds still exist in these homes today. They're no longer enforced, no longer enforceable, but they're still there. And many of you probably live in homes with those language in those deeds. This was not the action of rogue bureaucrats. This was an explicit policy of the federal government. The Federal Housing Administration had an underwriting manual which was distributed to appraisers all across the country. I have some photos of clauses from this manual in my book. The manual prohibited appraisers from approving developments like this that weren't for the same racial class. Not that any or very many projects were approved for the other racial class. And it also prohibited approval of developments that were near where African Americans might be living. And that would run, in the words of the manual, run the risk of infiltration by incompatible racial elements. That's what the Federal Housing Administration manual said. And with this policy, we created a white noose around African American neighborhoods in virtually every city of the country. The consequences of this policy remain with us to this day. This is not simply a historical curiosity. I'm not an historian. I wouldn't have written a book about a historical curiosity. This is something that directly affects the reality that we see still today. Because those homes that were built in the mid-20th century for white families only, by federal decree, sold at that time for $8,000, $9,000, $10,000. Today they sell for, today they, in inflation-adjusted terms, it's about $100,000 in today's money, and they sell today for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. The white families who are subsidized by the federal government to move into these developments, and I say subsidized, a white family could move out of public housing and into an FHA or VA financed home in one of these suburbs in the mid-20th century and pay less in their monthly housing costs than they were paying for rent in public housing. That's how enormous the incentive was to do this. And the white families who did this, because of the appreciation in value over the next couple of generations, gained equity. They gained wealth. Most families in this country gain what wealth they have from the equity they have in their homes. It's only the very wealthy who get it from speculating on the stock market or investing. The white families gained $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 in wealth and equity appreciation. They used that wealth to send their children to college. They used it to take care of emergencies, whether it was temporary unemployment or medical emergencies, or to subsidize their retirement, or to bequeath it to their children and grandchildren, who then had the funds for down payments for their own homes. African Americans, who are prohibited by federal policy from participating in this suburbanization and continue to rent homes in jobless areas, apartments in jobless areas where either public housing or in the private market, gain none of that wealth. The result is that today African Americans typically have incomes on average that are about 60%, 60% of white incomes. There's another story behind that. I won't talk about it this afternoon, but 60%. African American wealth is 10% of white wealth. That enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century, and that has never been remedied. We passed the Fair Housing Act in 1968. We just celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act. I think it was a flawed celebration because it was passed in 1968 only as an idea, and enforcement mechanisms weren't actually added until 1988. So we're really talking about the 30th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act. But the Fair Housing Act said to African Americans, okay, and you now move to Levittown, it's okay. You can move to Levittown or to the Little Boxes or to Lakewood. But those homes now selling not for $100,000, twice national median income, which any working class family can afford, they now sell for 6, 7 times national median income. unaffordable to working class families, either white or black, if they don't have funds from their parents or grandparents to buy them. So it's not an entirely empty promise, but it's a mostly empty promise. Levittown, for example, today is about 2% African American. In a broader area, that's about 15, 20% African American. So there's a big gap in what the Fair Housing Act did to remedy the de jure segregation that we imposed. There were many, many other policies, as I say. I think these are the two main ones, but there were many, many other policies that we followed. The example I gave at the beginning about the use of the judicial system and police to enforce racial segregation, that was not an isolated incident. There were hundreds, actually thousands, and I'm not exaggerating, thousands of cases of violence police protected violence that prevented African Americans from moving into white neighborhoods, previously white neighborhoods, particularly in the post-war years and the 30 years after World War II. The Internal Revenue Service, I've described a lot of this in my book. The Internal Revenue Service openly granted tax exemptions to nonprofit institutions that promoted racial segregation. It was a violation of the Fifth Amendment for the Internal Revenue Service to do so, and yet that was its policy. The example I'll give you here is that the University of Chicago, not so far away. Like I said, I didn't focus on Madison. I could have, I guess, but the University of Chicago, not so far away. Those of you who know anything about education remember the name Robert Hutchins. He was the chancellor of the University of Chicago for 15 years, from the late 1930s to the early 1950s. He maintained a staff of lawyers in the Office of the Presidency of the University of Chicago, whose job it was to sue to have African Americans evicted from the neighborhood around the University of Chicago if they bought homes in violation of these deed clauses that the FHA had required or that were put on as private deeds. This was an open policy. It was well known. You know, some of you may know, if you know, some of you may know in the 1980s, finally a case came to the Supreme Court where the IRS withheld a tax exemption from Bob Jones University because it prohibited interracial dating. So it's well established that it was a violation of the Internal Revenue Code and arguably of the Constitution as well, for the IRS to grant tax exemptions to institutions that were openly promoting racial segregation, yet never once was the a tax exemption canceled of an institution. And many churches in urban areas all across the country were the headquarters of anti-African American efforts to keep African Americans out of white neighborhoods. At the state level, the National Association of Real Estate Boards, a private organization, had through the 20th century, through much of the 20th century, a code of ethics that prohibited real estate brokers from selling homes in white neighborhoods to African Americans. It was an open code. Every broker in the country, every agent in the country had to subscribe to it. Every time a state licensing agency licensed a real estate agent or a real estate broker who subscribed to this code of ethics, the state licensing agency was violating the 14th Amendment. This is also a contributor to de jure segregation. This was not the rogue actions of real estate agents. You know, I'm not suggesting that real estate agents weren't prejudiced, that they wouldn't, if permitted on their own, have steered families to same-race neighborhoods. But all it would have taken in any state was for the state licensing agency to lift a couple of licenses to real estate agents who refused to show homes in white neighborhoods to black families, and the practice would have ended. Likewise, as I said earlier, talking about public housing, all it would have taken was for public, I mean, these were built, as I said, in integrated neighborhoods. So if the federal government had built integrated public housing in Langston Hughes's neighborhood, rather than segregated public housing, sure, some white families would have refused to move into it. They didn't want to live in an integrated building, even though they had been living in an integrated neighborhood. But there was a big housing shortage in the country. For every white family who refused to move in, there were 10 wanting to take its place. And you could say the same thing about Levittown or any of these other places. So I'm not denying that white attitudes were racially discriminatory in a powerful way, that there was white violence. I'm not denying that. What I'm saying is that but for government sponsorship, white prejudicial attitudes could not have segregated this country. Just as, before 1954, whites supported segregated schools in the South, but the government had an obligation not to cave into that support, and the same thing is true with housing. Now, I started out by talking a little bit about my interest in education, so it's not surprising to you, or it won't be surprising to you to learn that when I did the research for this book, I wanted to see how high schools and middle schools were teaching this history. So I examined all of the most commonly used textbooks in American high schools and middle schools today. And I concluded that they all lie about it. I don't know how else to say it. The most commonly used American history textbook in this country, at least as of 2 or 3 years ago when I looked into this, was something called The Americans. It's 1,200 pages. Within those 1,200 pages, I found one paragraph with the subhead, discrimination in the North, not segregation, but discrimination in the North. Within that paragraph, there was one sentence about housing, and the sentence read something along the following lines: in the North, African Americans found themselves forced into segregated housing. That's it. They looked out the window one day, they said, hey, look at this, we're in segregated housing. I've written a number of books, mostly about education before this, and I know that publishers spend a lot of money hiring copy editors to look out for passive voice sentences, but this is one they missed. How this happened. But this is really, I know it's a joke, but this is serious business, because if the next generation doesn't learn this history any better than we've learned it, they're going to be in as poor a position to remedy it as we've been. And so, one charge I want to give you is that, quite aside from your professional responsibilities, we're all citizens. We all have children or grandchildren or nieces and nephews who are in public schools. We have access to teachers and principals and school board members and superintendents, and we can begin to make an issue of how this history is being taught. And I guarantee you, if you make an issue of how the history is taught in schools, the conversation will leak out into the adult community as well, and may help to build the kind of civil rights movement that I think we're going to eventually need if we're going to address this national crisis. And let me say that racial segregation of neighborhoods underlies the most serious social problems that we face in this country. Clearly, as you all know better than I do, it underlies the persistence of multi-generational poverty. People living in segregated neighborhoods, African American young people living in segregated neighborhoods who have no access to the formal economy, living in places without hope, is one of the major contributors to poverty. We know your econometricians, I'm sure, have followed Chetty's work that demonstrate that the young poor children, African Americans who grow up in a segregated neighborhood, are less likely to have middle-class incomes as adults than equally poor African American children who grow up in less segregated neighborhoods. Segregated neighborhoods predict differences in life expectancy and health between African Americans and whites. They certainly, as I began by talking about, it is a major contributor to the achievement gap in educational outcomes. It certainly underlies the mass incarceration crisis that we have and the conflicts between police and young men in segregated neighborhoods. So this is the elephant in the room. And like I say, we're spending a lot of time worrying about symptoms and not dealing with the underlying cause, which is segregation, which we have convinced ourselves is de facto. Now, if we understood that we had a de jure segregation system, and if the understanding became more widespread, we don't have it now, there are many, many policies we could follow that would desegregate neighborhoods. They're not hard to think of. It's more difficult, as I said, than desegregating water fountains, but not all that impossible to do. They're all politically impossible today because we don't have this consensus that you all, having heard my talk, are going to now spread. But they're not hard to think of. The country has 3 housing programs today, 3 major federal housing programs. 2 of them are for low-income families. One you're familiar with is the Section 8 voucher program. It's commonly called Section 8. It's the housing choice voucher program that subsidizes the rents of low-income families. That program reinforces segregation. It contributes to segregation. It exacerbates it. A family with a low-income housing voucher, a low-income family who is more likely to live in a segregated neighborhood than an equally low-income family who doesn't benefit from a Section 8 voucher. The low-income housing tax credit is another one, a subsidy that's given by the Treasury Department to developers of low-income housing. Low-income housing tax credit developments are predominantly placed in already low-income segregated neighborhoods, intensifying their segregation. Developers with this tax credit would much rather build in low-income segregated neighborhoods. They don't have to hold 100 community meetings explaining why they're bringing black people into your neighborhood. So it's much easier to build it where there's no resistance. But that could easily be changed. We could easily change the way in which we grant these low-income tax credits and insist that developers build in high-opportunity neighborhoods that would help to desegregate. And the third housing program which we run, which is even bigger, is a subsidy to single-family homeowners in what are predominantly middle-class communities, and that's the mortgage interest deduction. And we could use that as leverage to desegregate. You know, one of the things I'm not saying this because I think it's politically realistic. We do not have the possibility of politically realistic programs to desegregate yet in this country, but one of the things I suggest in the book is that we withhold the mortgage interest deduction from families in suburbs that refuse to take steps to desegregate, that refuse, for example, to repeal zoning ordinances that prohibit the construction of single-family homes on small lot sizes, or townhouses, or even apartments, low-rise apartments. And we don't have to make it a punitive program. We could put the mortgage interest deductions of the families in those suburbs in escrow and return it to them when the suburbs does take steps to desegregate. So there are many policies that we could follow. And none of them, as I say, are politically realistic at this point. But they're conceivable, they're doable, and what all it takes is for you to begin to demand that they be done. So thank you very much, and I'd be glad to take questions or discussion.
We have time for questions, and there are some folks going around with microphones.
And you're saying that the federal government, the government did this. We're not the people through what you're talking about of us, the people. They're the government. We did it, just through the government.
I agree.
Okay, but
And
it's
only
us.
we can
We're
undo
the
it.
problem.
Only we can undo it through the government.
Okay, through the government. Good. That's.
Yeah.
I just heard that it was the government. The government. I thought they were aliens or something. That the people that were working doing it. So. Okay.
Nope. Like I said, you know, that's not an excuse for the government to have done it. The fact that this was popular in the white population that's why we have the Bill of Rights. It requires the government to resist popular majorities that violate civil rights. Me? Okay. You're going to call on people? Oh, okay. Sorry.
I'm curious about the term redlining. My understanding was that was something that was sort of a mechanism for refusing loans, financing for public housing. But the way you described it, it sounded more like it was inherent and just you couldn't sell to black families. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. I didn't talk about redlining. Redlining is a different policy. Redlining, does anybody have a copy of my book by any chance? No? Okay, can I borrow it for a second? This is a map. The cover is a map of Newark, New Jersey. The areas that are red are areas where African Americans were living and where banks therefore knew that they could not get federal insurance if they extended mortgage loans, and therefore they wouldn't extend mortgage loans in those areas. These maps, we conventionally think that this was a bank policy. The maps were drawn by the federal government. Maps of every metropolitan area in the country, like this, were drawn by a federal agency of the New Deal, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and it drew maps of every metropolitan area in the country to guide lenders, banks, about where they could expect to get federal insurance for loans. The result is that no lending or very little lending was ever done in African American neighborhoods. African Americans were forced to buy homes typically, and Chicago is a good example of this, on contract, like the installment plan, which meant that they accumulated no equity, unlike white families who had amortized loans. They accumulated no equity. They also, because their housing costs were higher as a result of not having access to federally insured loans, their standard of living was decreased. They frequently had to subdivide their homes and take in boarders, and the neighborhoods where they lived became more and more overcrowded as a result. And this all contributed to the economic inequality that I mentioned before. So redlining was a policy of the FHA that was directed at African American neighborhoods, denial of loans. And that's somewhat known. But what's less well known is this other policy of the FHA, which is much more powerful, and that is the subsidization of white suburbs, which is not a redlining policy. That was a whitelining policy. Yeah.
Could I ask a question about how the...
Oh, there you are. Okay.
Could I ask a question about how the GI Bill's provisions after World War II for housing support affected that? It played into what I think you just talked about.
Yeah, the VA just piggybacked on the FHA policies. Actually, Levittown, I think, had VA financing, not FHA financing. But for purposes of our discussion today, it was one program. Both the FHA and the VA used these redlining maps. Both of them subsidized the developments that were all white and refused to permit African Americans to live in them.
I was just going to ask if you've seen the study from the Chicago Federal Reserve Bank, came out about a year ago, where they looked at the Hulk maps for all the metro regions, mapped the census tract socioeconomic, demographic, racial change to the present, and found that that denial of opportunity continues to kind of explain patterns today.
Sure. If you overlay maps of urban African American poverty today over these redlining maps, there's a very, very great congruity to it. Yeah, somebody has to give you the microphone. So.
Sorry, I already have it. That's just, yeah, that's, my apologies. Could you give a sense, so, and I apologize, maybe you deal with this a little bit more explicitly in your book, about, because I know that there's at least some disagreement in terms of what role preferences do play. Can you give us a sense of the weight you place in the role of preferences for neighborhoods compared to the role of, I mean, get a sense, I mean, obviously it's not a specific percentage, but where would you place the onus? I have a sense that from the title of your book, but I don't know, could you just talk about that a little bit in terms of the role of law, the role of preferences, the role of, just get a sense of that?
Sure, you know, I think you're referring to the research of, what's his name?
I blanked on the study, but is it
yeah, I blanked on his name. Yeah, sure. And what he shows is that blacks are both blacks and whites prefer to live in integrated neighborhoods, but they define integration differently. And the result is that he claims that therefore, if even if whites claim they want integration, blacks prefer integration at a higher level of black residents, and therefore whites will start to flee once that exceeds it. You know, I made a big distinction between de facto and de jure segregation. You know, sophisticated legal scholars say that it's a meaningless distinction, that societal discrimination, you can't separate government from societal discrimination. That's probably true, but I think for purposes of understanding what our constitutional obligations are, it's important to understand the role that the government played. The thing that puzzles me about that study, and if I keep on talking about Lunga, I'll think of his name long enough. Schelling. Thank you very much, Schelling. The thing that puzzles me about this study is he claims that, for example, African Americans would define integration as 50% or close to, I think, 40% of a neighborhood, but if it gets that high, whites will leave. But, that can't be right, because if, first of all, to get to 40%, somebody had to be the first percent. So clearly there were 40% of African Americans who were willing to live in a neighborhood that was much less than 40% African American. And the same thing is true if you look at if you try to play that out for whites. So it's a nice theoretical exercise, but in practice it doesn't make any sense. The other thing is that there were thousands, as I said before, thousands of examples of white families, of black families, for example, who tried to be the pioneers moving into white neighborhoods and were rebuffed by violence. So if everybody waited till there was 39% of the neighborhood being black before they moved, this couldn't have happened. I see this as just a theoretical. I don't think it has government policy. If Levittown, if the federal government, if the Federal Housing Administration had told Levitt that he had to sell homes on a non-discriminatory basis, Levittown would have become an integrated community. And people could have theoretical preferences, and there might have been mobs who would oppose the black families. But if the police had enforced African Americans' rights to live in that community, the mobs wouldn't have been effective. So that's at least how I see it.
Hi. Thank you for this. So you spoke about some policies that you would sort of suggest to undo the segregation that we see in housing. And I was just wondering if you believe that we have like an ethical obligation to rectify the wealth disparities that we see, and sort of if you've thought about what kinds of ways, I mean, political feasibility aside, what you think would be or could be done or should be done.
Yeah, well, you know me by now. I think it's not only an ethical responsibility, I think it's a constitutional responsibility. And I can describe a theoretical program for you that's politically unrealistic. What the federal government should do, I said that Levittown today, and I'm just using that as the example, is 2% African American in a broader area that's about 15% African American. Well, the next homes that come up for sale in Levittown, up to 15% of the total, or an additional 13%, could be bought by the federal government for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, whatever the market rate is, and resold to qualified African Americans for $100,000. That would be a narrowly targeted remedy for a very specific constitutional violation. And if this history was understood, the courts would have to uphold it because it's so narrowly targeted to a specific constitutional violation. So yes, I think that should be in the spectrum of remedies that we dream about. But first, we need a civil rights movement that's going to, to do it. So the onus is on you, not me, to make this happen.
Thank you. Thanks as well very much for this presentation. Very enlightening and very helpful. I noticed that something that you didn't talk about, and I'd like myself to be brave and other people in the room as well. I think about Milwaukee, and I think about Madison, and I've heard that Milwaukee is one of the most segregated communities in the nation. How do we, maybe this, I'll ask it this way. Does your book include potential remedies, as you've been talking about a little bit? Is there hope in your book for, a revolution or an evolution to undo the damage that has been done?
Well, I think all the remedies I talked about apply to Milwaukee. This doesn't apply to Madison, but when I go from city to city talking about this, everybody wants to persuade me that their city is the most segregated place in the country, and it's really, but the problems exist in the county, not in the city. That's where these problems are being created. So what's the name? Is it Marquette County? What's the name of the county? Milwaukee County. The Milwaukee County has to prohibit exclusionary zoning ordinances. The low-income housing tax credit program in Milwaukee County needs to prioritize the placement of low-income housing in high-opportunity neighborhoods. Same thing is true of the Section 8 voucher program. Does the state of Wisconsin follow the federal income tax internal revenue code in granting an exemption for mortgage interest? Well, if it does, then this can even be done. My crazy idea could even be implemented at the state level. So there, I think, like I said, the menu of policies, and there are many. Here's one. Okay, I got one for you guys. Here's one. The University of Wisconsin is a competitive university, right? High school students have to have high qualifications to get into the University of Wisconsin. And I assume, I don't know anything about it, but like many competitive universities, it gives preferences to athletes. Athletes can get in more easily than other people. Violin players, whatever preferences. I know it's like some private universities. Does it have legacy preferences or no? Yeah, it does. Okay. Well, why can't the University of Wisconsin have a preference for young people who apply, who live in integrated communities? I'm talking about white kids. I mean, blacks as well, but white kids. Why can't it give preference to white kids who live in integrated communities? So instead of white families feeling they have an incentive to move to wider and wider and more exclusive communities to get their kids into the University of Wisconsin, it would give white families an incentive not only to move to integrated communities, but to press their own communities to integrate. So here, go ahead. Is there anybody from the admissions office here? No? Run with it.
Thank you also for your talk. You've described this forgotten history of very powerful laws and as well as vigilantism that enforce the way things happen. Was there also, did you discover any forgotten history in terms of resistance to the laws as they were put into place? Nowadays, we're in a political litigation phase where very few laws escape some interest group or other trying to defeat them and get the courts to take a stand. Did you discover something along that line all along, for instance, NAACP or other interest groups taking a stand in this?
Yeah, well, yes, obviously there was resistance to this policy, to these policies. There were some members of the Roosevelt administration who resisted these policies. Francis Perkins, the Secretary of Labor, was one. Harold Ickes and his appointees were others. He was the Secretary of the Interior. The President's own wife was probably the most vocal opponent of these policies. As you know, he was paralyzed and he couldn't get out into the country and meet people, and so he sent his wife as his ambassador everywhere in the country. And the more African Americans she met, the more angry she got about the segregated conditions, and the more she tried to press him to change his policies. His view was that nothing he did could interfere with his efforts to fight the Depression and end the war and win the war. And he thought that anything he did that was controversial, that would interfere with his getting support for those two programs, first the Depression in the 30s and then the war in the 40s, was not something he was willing to tackle. But I'm obsessed with this story that I told you about of Humphrey and Douglas fighting the Integration Amendment. But the NAACP, even though it represented members who desperately needed the housing, supported the Integration Amendment. There were a very, very few, a tiny handful of congressmen who supported it. One was a leftist, maybe communist congressman from New York, Vito Marcantonio, who was very eloquent in trying to oppose Humphrey and Douglas's efforts to defeat the Integration Amendment. So there were voices of opposition, but they didn't prevail.
So I have a question over here. I'm over here. Okay.
Oh, okay.
So I'm wondering, you talked about textbooks and how there's no information in there. I'm wondering if maybe you, or maybe this could be a plug, know of K through 12 syllabi on housing that could be used in the classrooms or could be put out maybe by historical societies or just regional groups that could be then used in the classroom?
Well, yeah, everywhere I go, I try to, if there are educators present, I ask them to try to help me to develop curriculum that can be used. Nobody's taken me up on the offer. It's hard, obviously, to develop a real curriculum. The organization Facing History is considering my request, but I haven't gotten a positive answer yet. The organization, the Zinn Education Project and Teaching for Change are two others that are considering doing this. So it's something I'm very, very concerned with, but I haven't succeeded yet in getting anybody to actually take on the job of doing it. You know, it's expensive. It's you have to produce materials. You have to test lesson plans, and it's not a simple thing to do. But I hope somebody will do it. We're here in an education building, right? Somebody going to do that.
Hi. I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about what you may have learned about the reciprocal relationship between school segregation and housing segregation. Clearly, your implication is the power of law about housing. As you know, there are folks who 40 years ago or so were purporting to show white flight resulted from school desegregation. And I also remember, and I can't remember the exact argument, but Gary Orfield has a piece somewhere about the reciprocal effect of school siting on housing. He was trying to argue that don't think this is only a one-way street. So I'm just curious, since you're an education expert as well, if you learned anything about that that's
well, it's somewhat
important.
It's somewhat a reciprocal relationship, certainly in the South, and I have a whole subchapter in the book about this. School placement decisions were made for the purpose of creating that residential segregation. As I mentioned at the beginning, you know, cities in the mid-20th century, early 20th century were broadly integrated. It's not that every other house was a different race, but they were broadly integrated. And what school districts, and there's a wonderful book that is coming out. Well, I don't know how far advanced she is, but a young historian in Chicago her name is Karen Benjamin, who's writing a book detailing, not the University of Chicago, Xavier College in Chicago, and I think she's moving someplace else. Huh? I think she's our graduate. Oh, she is? Well, congratulations. She's fantastic. And what she's demonstrated, she's a historian, and she's shown that school districts like Raleigh, Durham, Atlanta, Houston, and she's demonstrated in all these, going through the archives, explicitly segregated their cities by their school placement decisions. So they forced families to move if they wanted their children to be educated. So a place like Raleigh, for example, which was an integrated city in the early 20th century, they specifically placed, I forget the geography, but they placed schools for African Americans, segregated schools for African Americans in one part of the city and schools for whites in another part of the city, forcing the neighborhoods to segregate because families had to move if they wanted their children to be educated. And that same thing was true in other cities, and she's demonstrated this. Clearly, it's also a two-way street because, as I said earlier, families move to districts because they think the schools are better. It's a phony belief. What we should understand is that the test scores, which is how they evaluate these schools, reflect the socioeconomic status of the parents, not the quality of the schools. But parents don't believe that, and they move. So that's one way in which it's the other kind of relationship. But fundamentally, you know, we can, in northern cities today, there are borderline areas where you could fiddle with attendance boundaries to create more school integration. You could create some choice programs to create more school integration. But most middle-class white families live too far distant from low-income African-American families for any fiddling with attendance boundaries or this kind of thing to affect real desegregation. The only way to desegregate schools, in my judgment, is to desegregate neighborhoods, and that's what we should be doing.